Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Nizar Hassan. I'm joined by Timour Azhari. How are you, Timour?
Hey Nizar, I'm great this morning. Feels like spring weather is coming in. It's a welcome relief, and I'm especially happy because we're joined this week by a really special guest. He is Christian Taoutel. He is the head of the history department at the University of Saint Joseph. Christian will be joining us in a bit, but first we're going to get to some news. It was a news-heavy week with numbers going up and down across the board. And I think that it makes sense to start with the COVID update because this is sort of the first troubling series of events that we're seeing happening almost in slow motion. We have over the past week seen a steady sort of increase in the number of COVID cases in the country. Lebanon has been in a lockdown for nearly 3 months now. The country is now reopening. So on Monday, restaurants are coming back at 50% capacity. Gyms at 30% capacity, but we're seeing cases rising. Cases are now in the mid 3,000s. ICU capacity is in excess of 950, which is getting pretty close to the record numbers that we saw when we went into this lockdown in January. We have between 50 and 70 people dying per day, which is, sort of feels unacceptable. And then test positivity is between 15 and 20%, which shows you that there's a lot of undetected spread, and B, a very high caseload across the population. So we're clearly on an upswing here. Vaccines are picking up a little bit with more than 50,000 doses of the Pfizer vaccine arriving this weekend, which I think is the largest single shipment we've had so far. And we also have apparently signed an agreement for 750,000 more Pfizer vaccines. A private company has also said it's going to import 1 million of the Russian Sputnik vaccines. So it does seem like more doses are coming in, but at this point, we're still at only around 2% of the population vaccinated, which is an incredibly small number as the case numbers are going up. And speaking of numbers going up, Nizar, I mean, this week we saw the Lebanese pound hit a record low against the dollar.
Indeed, Timour, this week the fluctuation of the exchange rate between the Lira and the US dollar were quite scary. It was going up, which means the Lira value is going down for many days, quite dramatically, until it reached on Tuesday a record low of 15,000 lira per dollar, right? Just to remind everyone, it was 1,500. So this is
it's crazy.
right. So this is 10 times what it used to be. By that point, the lira had lost officially 90% of its value, right? Which means that local salaries have also lost almost 90% of their purchasing power in terms of most products in the market. And then after Tuesday, it started going down dramatically for some reason, and it reached all the way down to 10,000 or 10,500. And now it's not stabilizing, but now it's around 11,000, 11,500 again, which is much more reasonable than 15,000. And it feels like a continuation of the normal kind of increasing exchange rate from before. But why
Right.
this huge surge happened is up to many explanations, right? Some people said it's after the lockdown. There's a surge in demand for dollars for all the institutions and companies that are resuming work. Other people said it's a much more structural issue in terms of the banking system trying to pull dollars from the market to meet the deadlines for the recapitalization policy of the central bank, or the central bank itself pulling dollars. There are many possible explanations for this phenomenon, but what happened for sure is that everyone felt that it was an apocalyptic moment, right? Because suddenly it went from 10,000 to 15,000 in a couple of days. So basically you lost half of your the value of your salary in almost half in a day. It fueled all the uncertainty that already existed, all the fear already existed.
Yeah, and we did see protests across the country. I mean, there have basically been protests and road blockages in Lebanon for several weeks now because the currency has been declining, and there's basically no reason for it to stabilize or for the lira to gain value, because there's just no confidence in Lebanon, in the politicians to create any solution, first of all, to the destroyed financial system we have, to the economic crisis. And that's where you see this incredible decline of the Lebanese pound, where basically the minimum wage in Lebanon of 675,000 is worth $50. I mean, just imagine you're working, an entire month. Many people are only to earn $50, and so a major reason there, whether it is this post-lockdown surge or the central bank recapitalization policy, I'd say that the overarching reason seems to be that there's no confidence in politicians to come up with a solution. And we kind of saw, a continuation of that this week with the prime minister designate and the president sort of sparring over whose fault it is that a cabinet isn't being formed. And so just before the weekend, they had basically called on each other to resign effectively if they couldn't form a government. It started with Michel Aoun. He gave a speech where he was saying that it's up to Hariri to form the government, basically blaming the lack of government formation on Hariri not sort of taking into consideration the sectarian quota sharing in the country. And then Hariri responding that Aoun should reveal the real reasons why the cabinet isn't being formed, or call for early presidential elections, which would basically mean that Aoun is out of office. The next day, Hariri actually went up to meet the president. And after the meeting, he said there's, quote, an opportunity, and they will meet again on Monday. But as we are looking at that Monday meeting now, there's really few reasons to believe that the outstanding issues will be solved, which is basically that Hariri wants to form a government that doesn't give the Free Patriotic Movement, President Michel Aoun's party, a veto power in the government, which is a blocking third, while the president obviously wants that. And up till now, each side seems to be sticking to their guns. And meanwhile, we're basically seeing the country fall apart. Analysts and journalists and all kinds of people for the past several, years, and it feels now at least 18 months, have been pointing to the moment where subsidies are lifted as sort of a pivotal moment, because that's where you see people rely on fuel, medicine, and wheat to be given to them at sort of a reasonable price, right? And once that changes, then people, then we expect to see, whether it be unrest or just massive expressions of public anger. And this week we got many more indications that subsidies will soon be lifted, and indeed are being lifted.
Indeed, I mean the lifting of subsidies in Lebanon has tremendous effect because many basic goods are still subsidized to one extent or another, and when you lift off subsidies, that's the point where you're really floating the currency, right? Because there's no, if you look at the Lebanese economy now, the lira is not really pegged to the dollar anymore. However, there is no real clear policy of floating the currency. So what we're in is in this gray area where basically for the money in the bank, the value is different from the money in your hand. And also some products are subsidized, others are not. And it's not clear really what the real value of wages are.
Right.
However, when you lift off subsidies, this means that people will pay full price as if they are paying dollars for many basic products such as fuel and perhaps soon electricity and bread, etc. And so this is why it's such a pivotal moment, as you said. And this week we saw confirmations from officials that this is going to happen very soon. Diab said that subsidies on some products like fuel, and that's a quote, will end by the end of March. The finance minister talked to Bloomberg and said that subsidies will be lifted partially on some goods in the food basket, and fuel comes next. And many other kind of little statements that point us in this direction. But fuel prices are already going up, which basically leads everything else to become more expensive, because to go around with the lack of public transportation, this means much higher cost of transportation for everyone. But also fuel is basically what keeps the economy going under the current energy system. So this will have really huge effects if the subsidies are lifted off completely.
And the reason that all of this is basically happening is that the country is running out of hard currency, the dollars in the central bank that we can use to spend on these various different things like, wheat, like fuel, like medicine. That money is running out. And that money is basically the people's money. And what we saw this week is confirmation that the mandatory reserves in the central bank, this is what the central bank sees as the minimum amount of hard currency that it needs to have present. The central bank governor has apparently decided that it's no longer 17 billion, it is rather 15 billion. And that number has been revised down, which basically means that there's an extra 2 billion that can be used to fund various things, be it, fuel for the power plants or wheat or other forms of subsidies. What this is, though, is a further indication that the state's finances are running out and that we're really coming down to the wire here. Because once that money is gone, then you're in a situation where you don't have hard currency anymore. And that means that you basically can't afford anything. You can't buy fuel, you can't buy wheat, you can't buy certain medicines at the official rate of 1,500, which basically means that it's a free for all. Everybody has to buy those goods at the market price, which is, we saw go up to 15,000 lira, and it's sort of unimaginable to think that the average Lebanese person today in a country where the poverty is over 50% would be able to afford these goods at the dollar rate, at the market rate. And so the growing cry across the country in this moment is that people are going hungry. You hear it on the streets at protests. It's led on newscasts. It's everywhere, and we're seeing it. We're seeing riots in the streets, and we're seeing fights in supermarkets over subsidized goods. And it often feels like we're stuck in a closed loop in Lebanon, where we can't move forward because history seems to be busy repeating itself. And it's a somber topic, but I am very happy to have on the podcast this week Christian Taoutel, who is the head of the history department at the University Saint Joseph, and he is also an author of several books, including a book on the history of Lebanon's Great Famine from 1914 to 1918. He writes mainly in French, and the name of the book is Le Peuple Libanais dans la Tourmente, 1914 to 1918. We're very excited to have you on, Christian, to speak about this topic, even though, as I said, it is a somber one. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Timour. I am trying to be fine. The situation in Lebanon is extremely difficult, so we are trying to be okay, even though it's extremely difficult to feel good these days. But we keep hope and we keep thinking about our situation.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people feel the same way. And this week we're going to talk about a period of the country's history that is quite ill understood. It's barely taught, from what I understand, and in many ways was all but forgotten until recently. Because of the situation in the country and the fact that people are talking about going hungry again. And so Lebanon's Great Famine was this period of that spans between 1914 and 1918, where we saw massive death, massive destruction, emigration, really changed the face of the country. And that's what I'd like to get into with you now. And if we could start off by placing the famine in its historical context. What was the situation in this region at the time? What was taking place in the area we now call Lebanon, even before the First World War, when the famine happened?
Let's first think about as you asked, like let's think about what was happening in the region and in Lebanon mainly before World War One. So maybe the easiest thing is to go back like 50 years earlier, and we can see that, like, let's say almost since 1848. Beirut had begun to expand its walls, and the population of Beirut was increasing, and it became around 15,000 people. This happened just after and during and after the civil wars in the mountain. What we call the massacres of Christians by Druze in 1860. So it was like a civil war at that time. And this increased Beirut's population because Christians, Christian refugees, arrived in large numbers to the coast. Let's say
Right.
also that in 1888, Beirut became the capital of the separate province, like what we call wilaya. And Beirut became like a very important city at that time. So first I told you that the population of the city was increasing, and then I tell you that Beirut became a capital in 1888. The port of Beirut is built at that time, a very important port, one of the most modern ones at that time. And the population of the city became almost 120,000 people by the end of the 19th century. And this was, let's say, more or less a positive time for Lebanon. Hospitals were created, pharmacies were opening. We count almost 25 pharmacies opened in the last decade of the of the 19th century, which is a very large number at that time. Many universities, but we can cite the two main one in the capital, the Syrian Protestant College that became AUB later, and the University St. Joseph opened by the Jesuits at that time. The German hospital in 1884, the St. George Hospital in 1885, the Hôpital du Sacré-Cœur that was made by the Lazarist priests. The Asfouriye Hospital, known in Lebanon as Asfouriye, which is really what we call the psychiatric hospital. It was the Swiss missionaire who did it. The American hospital just closed near the Syrian Protestant College, which is known today as the American hospital. So say it was more or less a good time, even though the numbers show that by that time, at the end of the 19th century, almost 10,000 persons were leaving the region every year. And like it was almost 1% or 1.5% of the population by that time. And they were just leaving to go to the emigration. So they were going to Europe and mainly to Latin America.
So we were already seeing emigration from Mount Lebanon and Beirut before the onset of the First World War. And I think it was sort of economic factors driving that. Then what happens when the First World War is initiated, and how do we sort of enter that period where the country starts in a way, I mean, falling apart? Or it wasn't a country at that point, was it? It was just several wilayas that started being impacted by this war.
So yeah, we can say, as you just said, that immigration was not something that's starting during World War One. It was happening before, but it increased a lot during the war. What happened is that when First World War raged across Europe and beyond, of course, Lebanon was part of the Ottoman Empire, and even if it was kind of autonomous region, but it was part of the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman forces joined Germany, the German Empire, in this war, the Allies enforced a blockade of the entire eastern coast of the Mediterranean, which includes Syria, Lebanon, and the part of Palestine. And it was a kind of effort to cut the supplies to the Ottomans. And in return, Ottomans did a blockade also, but it was not a maritime one, but a land one, blocus terrestre. And it was introduced by Jamal Pasha, who was at that time the commander of the Turkish forces in Syria. And this is how cereals and wheat were prevented from entering Mount Lebanon. And this is how it started, let's say. So we can say that as of 1915, hunger touches Lebanon and slowly it becomes a famine.
So can I ask, what was the main motive, like politically, from the Ottoman side? Because we understood from the Ally side, but just to elaborate a bit more on the politics behind it.
Well, there was many reasons for the Ottomans to put a blockade on Mount Lebanon. First, and the most important one, is that they need the food and the supply for their own army. So they prefer to confiscate all this food, all this supplies for the good of their own soldiers. And second, even if it's not always said, but it's kind of known, it was like a punishment. The population living in Mount Lebanon during this time was more like the population was close to France and to the French feeling, let's say, during this war. Like people had enough with 400 years of Ottoman occupation, and when World War One started, a lot of people in Mount Lebanon were silently hoping that maybe something would change if Ottomans will lose this war. So it was kind of a punishment, and we can see this through the archives that I was working on in the Jesuits' archives at the St. Joseph University. Many of officials, many officers, many Ottoman officers, when they used to confiscate like the university St. Joseph buildings or the schools that were owned by the French missions at that time, they used to say, and this is written, they used to say to the population there, we do this to punish you because you are spies and because you work for France and because you are doing everything you can so Ottomans will lose this war. So you can see that here we have the politics from one side, and also the needs, the simple needs of a very big army, Ottoman army, that was hungry also. So they confiscated food.
And then beyond that political sphere, there's also a lot of blame that's put on, for example, locusts, jarad بالعربي, and also climactic factors. There was talk of, an extremely sort of dry winter with crops not getting what they needed. And then there was also the role of traders and merchants and middlemen in, during that time, who were accused of hoarding goods and preventing it from getting to the population. So I wonder, to what extent did those factors play a role in leading to the famine and in fact prolonging it?
Well, Timur, the Great Famine was a destructive result of a political and environmental factor. Let's try to resume it to the combination of three main factors. First, the severe famine because of the blockades. Second, the grasshoppers, the locust or the grasshoppers. We can mention this in a moment. In the archives I worked on say that in April 1915, huge dark clouds, hordes of locusts were descending to feed on plants, whether green or dry, and it comes from here the Lebanese expression al-akhdar wal-yabis. And third, the main reason was also the Lebanese themselves. Like it's not something that we would like to say, but at that time traders made profit, and a lot of people made the profit. And this reminds me a little bit of the scenes of people rushing into supermarkets in these days to buy financed oil and food product. Like I'm sure that you are seeing the very bad and sad images that we see on social media about what's happening in Lebanon today. It's something that reminds us of what happened 100 years ago. And it is important to mention, like when you mentioned the blockade, we should not forget that we are talking about two blockades. The first one was made by the Allies on the coast, and the second one, the most important one, was made by the Ottomans. And the responsibility here is for the Ottomans in what happened in Mount Lebanon, because they were the occupying forces. By international law, whatever happens in the land occupied is the responsibility of the occupying forces. So what happened in Lebanon is the direct responsibility of Ottomans, but also we cannot ignore what nature did and what the Allies did, and also what part of the Lebanese did by that time.
And the part of the Lebanese doing this, I mean, I remember when I was researching a story, there was talk of, putting dirt and sawdust and all kinds of material in the wheat to make it weigh more. They were talking about bread going black. I'm just wondering what the historical record tells us about what actually, Lebanese did to each other. And, especially, I'm sure it was a small group of Lebanese, right? Much like we see today. What does the historical record tell us about that?
Taimur, you did an excellent report about Bjerrin a few weeks ago that we read, and that shows what happened in some villages. And the archives also say why it happened. Well, we said it already. The Ottomans were responsible, the nature was responsible, but let's not hide. We have to face things. History should be responsible, and we should say what we really know about it. The archives tell us that some Lebanese traders, yes, were doing things that were completely illegal and not even moral. You mentioned as example, like putting some stuff in the food which was not part of the food itself and trying to sell it 10 times more expensive. We even have examples in the archives that some people sold, houses and lands for 2 or 3 bags of food or wheat or farine. I don't know how you say it in English.
Flower.
So yeah, flour, exactly. Thank you. So it happened. It happened, and it is happening today. When you go to pharmacies today and you want a medicine, they tell you "Maqtour, we don't have it," and you deeply know that they have it, but they are just waiting till next day because next day the dollar would have increased and they can sell it more expensive. And when you go to supermarket, it's the same. When you want to buy the finance oil or the cleaning supplies, and we have seen scenes of customers shouting and clashing with each other, and they just don't want to sell it today because they know that in 2 days it will be more expensive, so they can sell it for more. And sadly, this is also the responsibility of the local population. But the only difference is that by that time, during World War One, the management was the responsibility of Ottomans, while today the management is the responsibility of Lebanese. So today we are even more responsible of what is happening because we can change it, but we are not changing it.
So I think you raise a very interesting point because in the past, yes, there was this locust plague, there was the Ottomans, there was a naval blockade. But today in Lebanon, we don't have those circumstances, right? I mean, we're not suffering from massive crop failure. There's no locust plague, and there is no real siege on the country, although some politicians like to paint this idea that there is a siege, but practically there is no siege on the country. But what we do have is basically massive mismanagement, and we have a situation where, as you pointed out, there are these historical parallels. I want to sort of get to the numbers here because it is important to sort of quantify what happened, and there is a wide range on the numbers of what occurred during the famine, of how many people died and how many people left. Can you go into that a bit? What do we know about the effect of this famine on the country quantitatively?
Let's just go back 1 minute to what you were mentioning because it's very interesting. A lot of people are comparing what is happening today to what happened 100 years almost ago. In 1915-16, we had the typhus and the cholera, and today we have the COVID. So it's kind of a comparison that can be done. In 1915 and 16, we had the Ottomans who were giving us difficult times, let's say. And today, we can say that we have difficult neighbors also, close neighbors and less close neighbors. Like when we mention the Iranian policies and the Saudis policies and what's happening between USA from one side and the Russians on the other side, and all this pressure that is put on the Middle East and on Lebanon in particular, also would remind us of the context, the historical context of the pressure and of the tensions that we were going through during the First World War. And the third comparison that can be done, Taimur, also is the same bad mismanagement spirit that was existing in between 1915 and 1918. We sadly see it the same today, and I think this is somehow part of the Lebanese culture. I hope it will change one day. So we can of course do these parallels, let's say, between yesterday and today, but it will not be enough. So of course it needs more analysis and more comprehension. Going back to the numbers, since you were asking me about the numbers, let's just know that at this time in the beginning of the century, the population of what we call Lebanon, because it was not Lebanon yet, but like the Mount Lebanon, was estimated at about 400,000 people. And the American Red Cross mentioned later in the archives of the American Red Cross that the death toll was about 200,000 people. What we know is that this is the highest death toll by population of the First World War. Of course, it was kind of forgotten and also kind of not mentioned a lot, because comparing to what happened to the Armenian population through the Armenian genocide by that time, when you die by the sword, it's much more terrible and horrible than when you die of hunger, because when you die of hunger, you die silently and no one knows and no one sees this. So let's say that we don't have very, very precise numbers, but we estimate the range of death toll during World War One in Lebanon between 100,000 people and 200,000 people. In Mount Lebanon alone, of course. The Jesuits' archives are interesting ones because they mention a number that is 180,000 people. The Maronite archives, of course, they increase the number and it can reach 250,000 people. When you go to the Ottoman archives, they mention 80,000 people only. The French
Wow.
archive, yeah, and the French archives say between 100 and 200,000 people. So even if we go to the lowest number, which is the Ottoman one, 80,000 people is enough to say that this was a crime of war. We cannot use the word genocide because using the term genocide needs some laws and some une juridiction spéciale. We cannot talk of a genocide in this case, but you can talk of crime of war, crime de guerre. And what is sure is that almost one third of the population of Mount Lebanon died from the Great Famine.
And you've spoken about the number of people who died. What about the number of people who emigrated, both during the war and after? Because it seems to be quite a large number. And traditionally, when you speak about Lebanese emigration, when people speak about Lebanese emigration, including politicians in this country, they paint it in this sort of neo-Phoenician light, that it was Lebanese who left, seeking prosperity, and they became so successful, and it was almost a choice. But from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that most Lebanese left the country because they felt that they had no choice and they were pushed out in a way by the circumstances.
So, Taimur, maybe the fourth comparison that can be done about yesterday and today is also the people leaving the country. We know that today a huge number of young students are going to the embassies trying to get visas and to leave Lebanon, because even if you get the best diploma today and you start working, your salary will turn around $100 or $200 in the best case. And going back to what happened during World War One, it was the same. We know that before the war, every year a lot of people used to leave. And during the war, we don't have exact numbers, but after the war, a lot of people left. So the numbers are not easy to get because the Maronites give numbers that are very different from the other sources that we have. But what is sure is that almost one third of the population left. So if we want to simplify things, you can say one third died, one third stayed, and one third left. But I take it with precautions because I cannot confirm this number by archives that we have. But this is mainly what we know, and we know it from the people abroad. It means we know it from the diaspora who give us these numbers according to what they collected at the beginning of the century.
And this is the time when a lot of Lebanese were going to South America, wasn't it? Because there is a whole generation of Lebanese people who went to South America.
Yeah, Nizar. I had the chance to visit Mexico 3 years ago, and I've met with a lot of Lebanese people from Mexico, and I was kind of astonished by the numbers of people who came to talk to me, and they mentioned that they know nothing about Lebanon. They know that their ancestors left Lebanon during World War One. And what was very interesting for me is the fact that they don't even have Lebanese name families anymore. Like they have typical Mexican or Latin American family names. And when you ask them about it, they have an explanation. At the beginning of the century, when they left, before the war, during the war, or after the war, World War One, I mean, when they arrived to Latin America, most of them changed their family names because they were hoping that it will be easier for them and for their kids to have names that don't show that they come from the Arab world or that they could be assimilated to Turcos. All the Lebanese who went to Latin America, they used to be called the Turcos. Even if they were Lebanese or Syrians, they were called the Turcos. And being a Turcos at the beginning of the century in Latin America was a bad thing. It was not something easy to carry as a name. It was badly seen, and this is why most of them have changed their family names. But the fun part of this is that they have chosen family names that describe their Lebanese family names. And we have many examples that I cannot give you now, but we have many examples that we had through studies of Mexican families who have family names that were just a translation of Lebanese family names.
Oh, it would be super interesting to have an example of that. Do you by any
Well,
chance
I can
yeah.
I, I, I can just give you now two or three examples because I have seen this and I have worked on it. The Khoury family who became the Padre family. And also, we have a family name from Al Batroun and Al Qura area, which is Al Mkesh family. And when they arrived to Latin America, they were immediately called Sirio. So they became the Sirio family because they look serious. It's just the translation of Mkesh is someone who looks serious. And I have seen a lot of these examples that maybe we can talk about in another podcast one day. I would be able to prepare in advance these comparative families, and we can maybe talk about it.
That's great. No, thanks so much. And I do want to get to the present day, but just a last question here on the famine, because when you speak about a third of the population dying and a third of the population leaving, I wonder what effect does that have on the national psyche, on the village, on the family, on these locuses of life, of everyday life. I mean, when you've seen, and we have records of people walking through streets where they're just filled with dead bodies. You have the sound of dying people in the streets at night in Beirut. There's descriptions of people closing their windows at night so they could sleep because the sound of dying people was so loud. What was the effect of the national psyche? And that maybe brings us, a bit closer to today. I mean, what happens to a people and to a country when 2/3 leave either via death or emigration?
Your question, Taimur, leads me to tell you about what wrote the Turkish feminist author Halida Adib in her memoirs. She mentioned that the nights of Beirut were atrocious. You could hear people and kids in the street screaming "Jo'an, Jo'an," of course, which means "I'm hungry, I'm hungry." Also, Tawfiq Yusuf Awad, in his famous book Al-Dhaghif, tells us about child screaming and shouting for about the fact that they were hungry. A lot of American sources also that we have at the Jesuit archives mention some employees of the AUB and some employees of other institutions in Lebanon, like professors or the nurses or doctors that were working in Lebanon at that time. They mention horrible scenes of people screaming and shouting in the streets. Of course, this is not easy to live and this is not easy to remember. So this is why a lot of people who went through these difficulties wanted to forget this after the war. And as I told you, it was told to me by some Lebanese I've met in Mexico. They told us that they know that when their their grandparents or their ancestor came to Latin America, they had one target in mind. First, never tell the kids about what happened, and second, try to make it inclusive and easy way of inclusively having those Lebanese kids into Mexican schools or Argentinian schools. I'm sorry because my English will not help me to say what I really want to say, but what I'm trying to say is that the Lebanese who went there to Latin America were trying to hide what happened for two reasons. First, they don't want to talk about it to their kids because it's difficult to tell. It's not easy to tell that you saw your family dying of hunger. And it's not easy to tell that you did bad things during a time because you needed to feed your family. And second, because they wanted this new generation of Lebanese living abroad to be able to go to schools and universities normally without having to carry this horrible souvenir. So they had to change names and they had to hide this reality.
And is that perhaps then why we go so long in Lebanon without having a memorial to the famine? This happens between 1914 and 1918, and you were, I believe, rather than just being part of the first memorial, you were one of the people who came up with creating a memorial to the famine in Lebanon not too long ago. I mean, we're talking about 5 or 6 years, and so can you just talk a bit about this memorial and why did it take so long? Why did we go through? Is it because we went through recurring conflicts? Is it because people wanted to forget? And what does it mean to have a memorial or to not have a memorial?
Taimur, this needs a lot of calm and a lot of analysis and a lot of university studies to be able to understand why the Lebanese society lives in a big amnesia somehow. Half of the Lebanese population forgot that we were under Israeli occupation for 25 years almost. The other half of the Lebanese people forgot that we went through Syrian occupation also for almost 20 years or more. When you ask the Lebanese today, the young Lebanese today, they know nothing about Lebanese civil war. They don't want to hear about it. And I don't want to go through politics, but one of the worst things that we can hear in the streets today is the slogan "Kullun yani kullun," because this means that you don't want to know anything about what happened and you just want to turn the page and say everything that happened was bad. But this is not a good thing, because on the contrary, you have to go through every single detail of what happened to be able to understand who was bad and who was less bad and who could have been better. And I don't know if you understand what I mean, but the easiest thing to do is to say that all the past was bad. كلهم يعني كلهم, everything is bad and I don't want to talk about it. And this is what is happening, and this is what happened after World War One. We said that we don't want to talk about what happened, and then we stopped talking about it and we forgot. And 100 years later, in 2014, when I started preparing an exhibition and a book about World War One, I noticed that we have no memorial in Lebanon for the people who died from the famine. And like, can you imagine? Almost 200,000 people died, and we have not even one memorial in the whole country for this event. So yes, we started working on it, and with the help of it was mainly my idea, and then I had to go into collaboration with Mr. Ramzi Toufik Salame and the Banque du Liban, and also we worked with the municipality of Beirut. We organized the committee. We started thinking about what could be the memorial. The University of St. Joseph was hosting this, the whole idea. And finally, we were able to work with the artist, young artist Yazan Halwani, and we got the memorial that is today just facing the French embassy and just close to the University St. Joseph on Damascus Street, Rue de Damas. When you go from Sodeko Square to the Museum of Beirut, you can see this monument, but it's still covered because we still did not have the authorization to inaugurate the monument. And probably you will ask me why, because of political reasons. I cannot go into this now in details, but every Lebanese political party wanted to take this event for his side, and this made complications, and we ended up not even inaugurating the monument. And anyway, even if I have been contacted recently by many officials mentioning that they finally get an agreement to open the monument to make it like visible to people, I don't think it's the right time. People are fighting in supermarkets for food. Can you imagine inaugurating a monument for famine today? What a bad idea it would be, and how humiliating for the Lebanese people of today to tell them that while you are hungry, we are inaugurating a monument for famine. So I think that my work, sadly, my whole project was supposed to be inaugurated in 2016. The whole thing was postponed because of the political events and context. And today, I think it's not the good time. So I will have to wait more, maybe 2 or 3 years more, so we can maybe one day see the Place de la Famine honoring the victims of World War One.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say we hope for that too. I believe when I spoke to you about this last, you said, these people these victims have been sort of left without any remembrance for over 100 years. So a few more years is not too much for them in a way. And definitely, it seems that in the situation we are in today, it would be very tone deaf to inaugurate a memorial to the famine when people are speaking about famine once again.
Yeah,
Um,
Taimur, exactly. And I'll be honest with you, I have fears because can you just imagine we say tomorrow afternoon we will inaugurate a monument for famine, and the president or the prime minister will come to cut the ribbon and take the pictures. I'm afraid that the protesters will leave the supermarkets where they are fighting now, and they will come to destroy the monument to make some vandalism. And I would understand this because it will be even more insulting to tell to the Lebanese people that while you are hungry, we inaugurate a monument for famine. So sadly, it's a bad timing for me for the project, for the whole memorial. It was supposed to be done earlier. It hasn't been done, so now it's not the right moment.
right. I mean, what place is there for history in a country where history is repeating itself?
Yeah, history kind of repeats itself, but we live and we think and we act, so we can try to think ahead of time about these things. We can try to avoid the future catastrophes if we just look at the history books. Okay, we have a problem in Lebanon. We don't have one history book for everyone. Every school has its own history book. So this is a problem on one way, but even on the other way, it's not that difficult to look at what's happening today and to imagine what will happen tomorrow. Like, I don't want to go into politics, but when you see that the president and the prime minister had to meet 18 times until now, they have not decided who are the 15 or the 20 names they want to put on the list to form a government. Like, it's make it. I become crazy when I hear this. Like, if you go to all the Lebanese universities, don't you have good professors? Don't you have good doctors? Don't you have good engineers? Don't you have good historians, good journalists? Like, they really cannot find 20 good people that fit that job. I cannot believe it, because when Lebanese go abroad, they become excellent and they take the best positions.
Christian, we were so happy to have you on. We sadly have to wrap up, although I think we could speak for several hours about this topic. And I think that I speak for everyone at the Lebanese Politics Podcast when we say we'd love to have you back on again. It's a very somber topic to speak about, but incredibly interesting. And really, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you, Taimur. Thank you, Susan and Nizar, for being here. Also, for helping to prepare this podcast. And thank you for everyone who would listen. And I would like to end on a positive note, if you allow me. After World War One and the Great Famine, we saw Dawlat Lubnan al-Kabir, the state of Greater Lebanon. So it was a positive start for Lebanon. And I hope that today I hope that history will repeat itself, and after all the crises and the difficulties that we are going through today, we will have also another great Lebanon that will come from all the bad things that are happening now.
Thank you for coming, Christian. It's really enlightening to always to listen to what happened before and how it connects to today. And I'm pretty excited to be planning future episodes with the team about Lebanon's history. That's one of my favorite things to do on the podcast. But also, I think sometimes teaching history is better than analyzing or over analyzing on the present moment because of these similarities and the various interests and forces that are at play. So thank you so much, Christian, for coming. We'll be back with another podcast, another episode next week. Me and Ben will be on that episode. And until then, I'm Nizar Hassan.
I'm Taimur Azhari.
I am Christian Taoutel.
And this has been the Lebanese Politics Podcast.
Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Red, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Omar El Fil.